that. But I also believe that your friendship and relationship and history with Donald Trump weighed more heavily than him just wanting to make sure that justice was done by a person in the justice system, that you were treated so unfairly. There are thousands of people treated unfairly daily. How your number just happened to come up in the lottery, I'm guessing it was more than just luck, Roger, right?
I don't really feel like arguing with this Negro.
I'm sorry, what was that? Roger? Roger? I'm sorry, what did you say? I'm sorry, you're arguing with whom?
Slavery surnames tell a true, compelling story. It connects us to our true roots, America. There are documented cases of individuals having their names changed, but it is out of the ordinary for an entire racial group of people to have a name change every so often. In American slaves' short history, we have had several. When slavery was flourishing, nigger and black were two of many disparagements for slaves. When I was a youngster, slaves were called colored. When Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was leading the descendants of slaves, we were called Negroes. Black succeeded Negro as a major term of self-definition during the Black Power years. In the late 1980s, in the aftermath of a smaller cultural, nationalist movement, African Americans superseded black as a preferred term of self-reference. However, if we start at our beginning back during slavery, our racial name was slave. It's clear to see that the leadership of American slaves is confused about where their people's roots are planted. To put it bluntly, descendants of slaves don't know who we are because no one has told us from whence we, as a group, really came, or how we as a people came about. Having so many name changes would indicate that, even though bewildered and disoriented, we are still seeking our identity. Immediately after the descendants of slaves, or Negroes as we were known in those days, got the right to vote, it seems judicious politicians would have wanted to know every detail of something as important as changing the name of a group of people who were once enslaved in America but are now an integral part of the American infrastructure. If we look at slavery from a lawful point of view, it should have taken an act of Congress, or some other arm of the government, to change the descendants of slaves' names. We are a permanent part of America and should be represented in our society legally and politically. If slaves had been properly freed from slavery and then properly reformed as freed slaves, legally and formally, our name wouldn't have been changed, unless it was changed lawfully. There would be documentation showing the legal name change, why it was changed, who recommended the change, and who voted in favor of or against the change. If America were an honorable country and believed in fair play, the descendants of slaves would be recognized as America's only offspring and allowed our proper status. Dumping the American slaves in their hour of greatest need was a dishonorable act. Legally, American slaves' true history and all of our ethnic group name changes, and the reasons for the changes, should be recorded and kept adjacent to the United States Constitution. From a moral point of view, slaves should be declared America's firstborn in the Constitution. This didn't happen because, as a rule, criminals don't keep records of their crimes. The U.S. Constitution is our country's record. We don't want to put in writing, in our Constitution, that our country is guilty of heaping injustice upon the innocent. America is just as guilty as any criminals who kidnap, maim, rape, and murder. Slaves were kidnapped and brought to America where they were bred to be ignorant and were subjugated, tortured, maimed, even murdered. These crimes were illegal then, and they still are. To make my argument that descendants of slaves are still slaves and not Africans, nor African Americans, let us deal with the crime of kidnapping in a broader sense. Usually when people are abducted and then later released, they are, in most cases, returned to their loved ones, or they go back to being who they were before. This tells us that if the progeny of those slaves who were captured in Africa, and then enslaved in America, had still been Africans at the close of the Civil War, they would have gone back to their respected African tribes legally and with full honor. Our predecessors were no longer Africans. They were now a mixture of nationalities. Through selective breeding and mind manipulation, they were transformed into slaves. They were a brand new people because they had been given a complete mental, physical, and emotional makeover. After the Civil War, whites told slaves they were a newly freed people, so that's what they believed. They were naive, abandoned slaves. Being sorely uninformed, whites tricked slaves into thinking they were free Negroes. This is when the American slavery cover-up was started. Whites couldn't legally call slaves slaves anymore. It would not only describe the crime, it would point out the evidence. Consequently, they started calling us Negro. In several languages, Latin, Spanish, and Portuguese, among others, Negro means black. American slaves is a newborn nation that was bred by white Americans. America is our parent country and our motherland. By law, it was, and still is, America's duty to officially name us. That's the first thing a parent does to their newborn when they enter this world. The same should also apply on a larger scale to a newborn ethnic group. However, to put our identity into proper perspective, America did name us. Our mother country named us slaves. Like it or not, that's our birth name. American slaves are a case study of how a brand new, different nation was created. The world is just now becoming conscious of it. The descendants of slaves must also be made aware that the slave mentality, which controls our racial destiny, was altered intentionally because, at that time, America didn't need African Americans or any other free Americans. America needed slaves. The Indians wouldn't cooperate, so here we are. We have now evolved into an easily recognizable group of American people. If freedom is ever to be obtainable for all descendants of slaves, we must know and accept the truth of who we are. True, there are some African Americans in America, they are legally attached to Africa. Descendants of American slaves have no attachment to Africa. All our ties are to America, our mother country. Fooling our people into thinking they are Africans and inducing them to change their names to sound African, is nothing more than another attempt at covering up the crime of slavery. What's the point? I would like to make my position clear. Since America has been in existence, there has been only one ethnic group of people created, born, and brought into their mental and racial existence on her soil and under her holdings, the American slaves. The point is we are America's only child but we don't know it. To prove my point, let me share with you our proper identity and how all of these epithets came about. Our foreparents were bred to be slaves, so that's what they were named and what they were called. Before the Civil War, and during the war, they were still called slaves because that's what they were. After the war, they were released into degradation, still without honor. They were now abandoned slaves because that was their true condition. At that time, whites told us we were Negroes and we accepted that handle because we didn't know any better. When Dr. King was leading us, we still thought we were Negroes, but we were gaining wisdom. Because we now had a leader who was not afraid to seek the truth and try to find justice for all of his people. Being a moral person, he couldn't be bought off. Seeking justice for all cost him his life. America's only offspring wound up without proper identity, without a leader, and no cultural direction. Drifting aimlessly, we have evolved into confused slaves because we think we are African Americans. Whites still call us niggers, and blacks the first verbal slanders they used to remind us we were slaves. Slaves have had many names that are slanderous, but our next popular name was colored. This was more tolerable and seemed appropriate because of the color variations in our complexions. But a long while later during one of our movements, someone figured if Caucasians with their own wide variety of lighter skin tints were white, then slaves with their own wide variety of darker skin tints must be black, and the name quickly caught on. Our leaders disregarded the fact that, at one time, black was considered more of a slur name than was nigger. Our people accepting black as our racial name now, knowing how much we hated being called black then, tells me that once we know the truth of who we are, we will again accept our rightful name. Not only did the word black cease being a racist term, black became our source of enlightenment and ethnic pride because it proudly, but not always accurately, distinguished us from other ethnic groups. Most modern-day slaves had barely gotten used to saying the word black out loud, except when slandering each other, when we underwent something of a silent movement. And we were slickly renamed African American. This time, it appears our racial name was changed with this rationale: if there are French Americans and German Americans, and the list continues, then we must be African Americans. Most descendants of American slaves have dark skin and tight, curly hair that is like dark-skinned Africans. And most of us are convinced that the humans who started our slave nation came from Africa. However, with the exception of a few individual slaves who claim they can trace their lineage back to Africa, the bulk of the descendants of slaves don't have a known, proven, legal lineage predating slavery, and no documented connection to Africa, whatsoever. Being called slur names, and having derisive nicknames is as American as apple pie. Consequently, when the descendants of slaves were fallaciously named African Americans, the name stuck, and somehow persists. I hadn't been in business very long before the advent of the African American designation, and I still didn't know too much about the underlying functioning of America, but one thing I did know. Being called an African American wasn't a step up in life for me. I wasn't then, and I have never been, treated like German Americans, Russian, or Italian Americans, not even when I was in the limelight of my business career. I always have been, and still am, treated like I am descended from slaves.